By early 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic had entered a decisive phase. The era when German U-boats roamed freely was coming to an end. Allied air cover now stretched far beyond the coastline. Radar and sonar had matured, and American hunter-killer groups no longer waited defensively for attacks. They actively sought them out. For the crews beneath the waves, the ocean had become smaller, more dangerous, and far less forgiving. Yet some submarines still carried the reputation of past success. U-66 was one of them. Over the course of the war, it had taken part in multiple wolf packs, sending dozens of merchant vessels to the bottom and disrupting Allied supply lines across the Atlantic. Its captain, Gerhard Seehausen, was young even by wartime standards, but experienced enough to know that survival at sea depended on discipline, timing, and caution. Unfortunately, by March 1944, caution alone was no longer enough. After months at sea, U-66 was running low on fuel and torpedoes. Mechanical issues plagued its diving systems, making prolonged submergence risky. Like many U-boats at this stage of the war, it depended on a carefully planned rendezvous for resupply. The meeting point lay west of Africa, remote, but no longer safe. American patrols filled the skies, and Allied warships swept the sea with increasing confidence. When the supply vessel failed to arrive on time, Seehausen faced a dilemma with no good options. Diving would conserve fuel and reduce visibility, but damaged valves and limited diesel reserves meant the boat could not remain submerged for long. Staying on the surface increased the risk of detection, but it was the only way to search the horizon and hold on to the fragile hope of resupply. He chose to wait. While the submarine traced slow circles on the open sea, fate approached from above. An American TBM-1C bomber patrolled the region, its crew trained to recognize the smallest irregularity on the water's surface. What first appeared as a dark shape soon revealed itself as something far more dangerous, a surface submarine, isolated and vulnerable. The pilot radioed the sighting immediately, transmitting coordinates and movement patterns. The message was picked up by a nearby American hunter-killer group, and one ship in particular responded without hesitation. The destroyer escort USS Buckley received the order to investigate and sweep the area. For its commander, Lieutenant Commander Brent Abel, this was exactly the mission his crew had trained for. As Buckley increased speed and altered course, two worlds began moving toward collision. On one side, a German submarine waiting for salvation that would never come. On the other, an American warship guided by doctrine, technology, and the quiet certainty that the tide of the Atlantic War had turned. The hunt was no longer theoretical. It had become personal and irreversible. Darkness favored neither side that night. The sea was calm, but visibility was treacherous, just enough moonlight to reveal shapes, not intentions. As USS Buckley closed the distance, its bridge crew strained to separate shadow from steel. Radar offered little clarity at this range. The ocean, vast and empty, concealed its prey well. Commander Abel understood the danger of haste. Firing blindly would waste ammunition and reveal position. Instead, he studied the horizon until his eyes found what instruments could not. To the west, the moon's reflection stretched across the water like a pale runway. He adjusted course deliberately, maneuvering so that whatever lay ahead would be forced into that silver path. It was a quiet, calculated move, one rooted in patience rather than aggression. On the submarine, tension grew with every passing second. Lookouts scanned the darkness, unsure whether they were being hunted or merely watched. When the silhouette of a ship finally emerged, uncertainty vanished. There was no response to identification flares, no friendly signal. The realization settled heavily over the crew. They had been found. With damaged diving gear and limited fuel, submerging was no longer a realistic escape. Captain Seehausen faced a brutal truth. The submarine had been designed to strike unseen, not to trade blows on the surface. But there was no alternative. Orders were given, guns were manned, torpedo crews prepared what little remained of their arsenal. The first torpedo cut through the water, a desperate gamble launched into the darkness. On Buckley's bridge, the change in course moments earlier proved decisive. The weapon passed harmlessly astern, leaving only a trail of bubbles and a brief chill across the deck. It was a miss, but more importantly, it was a warning. Open fire. The night erupted. American guns spoke in unison, 20 millimeters, 40 millimeters, and 3-inch shells tearing across the sea toward the exposed submarine. On the U-boat's deck, German gunners returned fire with determination bordering on defiance. Tracers arced high, too high, their aim betrayed by darkness and chaos. Shells slammed into the submarine's superstructure, shaking the conning tower with each impact. Men fell. Others stepped forward without hesitation, filling the gaps, loading and firing amid flying steel. As the submarine began to slip out of the moon's reflection, Abel ordered his guns to hold. The pause offered the U-boat a fleeting chance to regroup. Wounded sailors retreated below. Anti-aircraft guns barked defiantly, one round even punching through Buckley's smokestack, a reminder that the enemy was far from finished. But the balance could not be reversed. Buckley's fire resumed with renewed intensity, its broadside overwhelming the exposed deck. The submarine twisted and turned in evasive maneuvers, but each attempt to escape only tightened the American grip. When Seehausen ordered his boat to turn and fire its last torpedo, it was not an act of confidence, it was an act of necessity. One final chance, one final decision. And as the torpedo left the tube, both crews understood. The battle had reached its point of no return. The sonar call came without drama, but it carried the weight of fate. A torpedo was running toward Buckley's starboard bow. On the bridge, there was no panic, only action. The helm was thrown hard over, steel groaning as the ship cut sharply through the water. For long seconds, the crew watched the pale trail of bubbles draw closer, then slide past. The torpedo missed. Again. For the men aboard the submarine, that miss was devastating. The last torpedo was gone. There would be no second chance, no hidden reserve. Captain Seehausen understood what that meant. The sea around him, once a place of concealment and opportunity, had become a trap. Abandon ship. It was the order every submariner feared, not because it meant defeat, but because it meant surrendering to chance. In darkness, under fire, with cold water waiting below, survival was no longer something a captain could command. It could only be hoped for. As shells continued to strike the battered hull, several German sailors scrambled through the hatches and leapt into the sea. On Buckley, the gun crews did not see them. From a distance, the submarine still moved. As long as it moved, it was a threat. Commander Abel was not willing to let that threat linger. He maneuvered closer, pushing his ship into point-blank range. The U-boat's guns had fallen silent, its deck torn and scorched. But Abel could not assume it was finished. A crippled enemy could still kill. Then came the decision that defined the battle. Ram it. The order cut through the noise and smoke. The helm turned. 1,400 tons of steel surged forward, closing the final distance between hunter and hunted. The impact was brutal. Metal screamed against metal as Buckley slammed into the submarine's hull, riding up and grinding along it. For a brief, surreal moment, the two vessels were locked together, enemy ships fused by force and circumstance. German sailors emerged from the wrecked conning tower, some intending to abandon ship, others acting on pure instinct. Seeing the American deck just feet away, several raised their personal weapons and fired. The response was immediate. Fists, boots, empty casings, anything within reach became a weapon. Hot coffee was thrown, bodies collided. This was no longer modern naval warfare. It was something far older, rawer, and more human. Realizing the danger of being boarded, Abel ordered engines full reverse. Buckley lurched backward, scraping violently across the submarine's hull. Germans clung to the rails, forced to choose between falling back onto their dying ship or being carried away aboard the enemy. Then, without warning, the sea erupted. A massive explosion tore through the water where the submarine had been. Flame, debris, and pressure surged upward, followed by an unnatural silence. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left, only wreckage and men struggling in the dark. The battle was over. By the morning of March 6, the ocean where the battle had raged looked no different from any other stretch of the Atlantic. No markers, no monuments. Yet what had occurred there reflected a much larger transformation in the war at sea. This was no isolated victory. It was evidence that the balance of naval power had decisively shifted. For the United States Navy, the destruction of U-66 validated years of adaptation and learning. Early in the war, American forces had struggled against German submarines that exploited gaps in coordination and technology. By 1944, those weaknesses were largely gone. Aircraft, surface ships, radar, sonar, and command doctrine now worked together as a single system. The submarine was no longer an invisible predator. It was a target tracked, pressured, and denied escape. The role of air power in this engagement was especially telling. Without the initial sighting by the patrol bomber, the encounter would never have occurred. From that moment on, the submarine's fate was shaped not by chance, but by information. Constant updates guided the surface ship, shrinking the ocean and stripping the U-boat of its greatest advantage, anonymity. From a strategic perspective, U-66 represented a pattern seen across the German submarine force in the final years of the war. Crews were experienced, often courageous, but increasingly constrained by shortages of fuel, spare parts, and safe resupply routes. The ocean they once dominated had become hostile territory. Forced to remain on the surface longer, they faced an enemy that now controlled both sky and sea. There is also a deeper, human dimension to this encounter. Both crews fought with determination. Both followed orders shaped by necessity rather than ideology. The young German captain did not lack resolve. He lacked options. The American commander did not seek glory. He sought certainty that the threat before him would not rise again. The fact that USS Buckley suffered no fatalities while rescuing dozens of enemy survivors underscores a defining characteristic of the late Atlantic War. It was ruthless in execution, yet increasingly professional in conduct. Victory was measured not in spectacle, but in outcomes: secure sea lanes, protected convoys, and a war brought closer to its end. In that sense, the sinking of U-66 was not merely a tactical success. It was a quiet confirmation that the age of the lone hunter beneath the waves was over. When the sea finally grew quiet, there were no cheers. No sense of triumph lingered on the deck of the destroyer escort. Only exhaustion and the unsettling awareness that something rare and terrible had just occurred. In the dark water, fragments of steel drifted beside men clinging to life. Reminders that modern war, for all its technology, still ended in the same human reckoning. USS Buckley remained on station for hours, circling slowly, pulling survivors from the Atlantic. 36 men were rescued from a crew of 62. Many had emerged during the fighting itself, acting not out of strategy, but instinct. They were cold, wounded, and stunned by how quickly the night had turned against them. They were enemies, but they were also sailors saved by the very ship that had destroyed theirs. Commander Brent Abel would later receive the Navy Cross for his leadership. He survived the war and returned home, carrying with him the memory of a decision that few officers ever faced: the choice to close with an enemy, not from a distance, but hull to hull. It was not a decision born of bravado. It was born of responsibility to his crew, to his mission, and to the certainty that the threat had to end. Captain Gerhard Seehausen did not survive. He was never recovered. At just 26 years old, he went down with his submarine, bound to the fate of a war that had already begun to slip beyond Germany's grasp. His story is not one of villainy, nor of glory, but of a young commander trapped by circumstances larger than himself, by shortages, by changing technology, and by an ocean that no longer offered refuge. The sinking of U-66 did not alter the outcome of the Second World War, but it captured something essential about its final years. It showed how innovation can overtake tradition, how control of information can outweigh courage, and how quickly the hunter can become the hunted. It also revealed the limits of warfare where, at the end of all calculations, men still meet face to face, stripped of abstraction. The waves have long since erased the scars of that night, but the lesson remains. War is not decided only by machines or numbers, but by moments, by choices made under pressure, when there is no safe option left. And that raises a final question worth considering. When history forces such decisions, what truly defines courage, the will to fight on, or the responsibility to end the fight? If this story made you reflect on the hidden cost of naval warfare, share your thoughts below. And if you value the lessons history leaves behind, consider staying with us as we explore the next chapter written on the world's oceans.